Hey everybody, welcome back. Good morning to you guys. It's let's see, Monday, April 27th. We're about to get our lecture underway for Intro to Philosophy for you guys here at Chapman from 9 a.m. to 9:50. So get comfortable. Hope you guys are doing well rested, and had a great weekend. But we just have another couple weeks of instruction before getting ready for the final. Today we have another important meeting on our current subject of the philosophy of mind, so try to advance a little bit further in our notes, and then we'll be good for today. Yeah. Yeah, so we have a couple more meetings this week on this philosophy of mind stuff. Hello to you, good morning to everybody. Anyone else? We're a little early, so we have a couple minutes till class time, but anybody obviously that's showing up, welcome here. Hope you guys are having a great morning so far. Okay. All right, 3 or 4 minutes left, so plenty of time. A little ice latte, kind of wake me up. Just checking out my cat. She's walking all over the place over here, off stage. Kitty. Hey. What's up? Hey. Kitty. Hey, kitty. She's like hiding right below the camera. It's pretty cute. Good morning. Hi, Emily. So just about another minute and we'll get going. Hey, Marissa. Hi. Good morning to you too. Good to see all you guys. Okay. All right, guys. So it's pretty much 9 a.m. So welcome back to all you. Good morning. Let's get underway. And today we just want to try our best to finish up the article by Daniel Stoljar that we were working on Friday, and then we'll definitely be able to finish that one and then move into the next author, which is J.J.C. Smart. So just a little more material on philosophy of mind. A couple meetings this week should be enough to get it done, but we have plenty of space in the class to cover all the topics that still are left in the schedule, so no worries about that. Obviously keep your mind on the next essay that you guys are turning in, not due on this coming week, but the following Monday, the 11th. And then the final is May 19th, but I'll give you guys the study guide for that next week so that you'll have around 2 weeks to look at it. So for now, anyway, we'll focus on this second essay, and then starting next week when I distribute the study guide, you can start looking at the information for those answers, and we'll have a couple of review sessions during week 14. So anyway, we got our schedule set out. Let's resume, I guess, our lecture on Daniel Stoljar's article called Physicalism. And like always, anybody who wants to say hello, good morning, or anything else, ask questions, comments, definitely feel free to just chime in and get into the chat. Always appreciate hearing from you guys. All the other students do as well, I'm sure. Hey, Ella. Okay. So then let's try and recap the basics of the beginning part of Daniel Stoljar's essay. So we're still going over this one. Daniel Stoljar and his paper from 2005 is called Physicalism. Okay, so the bigger picture, we're learning all about the philosophy of mind, which is the area of philosophy that considers questions about consciousness, perception, thought. How are those things possible? What's the nature of the mind or of consciousness? Is it merely something physical? Is it something that's not physical in some sense? And there are two big positions in the philosophy of mind that we're kind of trying to learn about. Number one, there's monism. So monists believe that the whole universe, everything in it, is just made out of one type of substance. And the dualists, the other camp, those are the people who say that the universe and all things are made out of two different types of substances. Now, what are these substances that are being discussed? Okay, so on the one hand, there's physical matter, which is claimed as anything that's extended in space. So the ultimate constituent of that would be the atom. And the other possible substance is mind, which, as it's talked about in philosophy, the mind is considered to be something that's not extended in space. So it literally has no size or shape or mass or anything, but yet it's thinking. So some monists are what are called physicalists. Those are the monists that say that the only substance is matter, and everything's made out of matter, even you and your consciousness. So it's basically all just made out of atoms at the end of the day, and there's nothing that's non-physical about it. So according to a physicalist, consciousness is the result of the brain activity, and there's no other phenomenon responsible for it. So consciousness is essentially rooted in the physical brain. There's also idealism, but that's the monist which says that the only thing that's made in this universe is made out of thoughts and the mind. But we're really mostly interested in physicalism versus dualism. Dualism is the view that there's both substances, and we considered one lengthy argument for that from the classic philosopher René Descartes, and his argument was basically that to make it cut it straight to the chase and make a long story short, you know you exist because you have a mind that's thinking, and you know God exists because you have an idea of him. And since he's perfectly good, he wouldn't trick you or deceive you about things that are really clear. But one thing that's really clear is that if you can imagine two things existing separately, then they really could be separate. And since you can imagine the mind and the body existing separately, like for example, think of the method of doubt, then those two things must really be able to exist separately, and therefore they're not the same thing. Okay, and then now we're working through Daniel Stoljar to see the other side of this argument. Okay, so he's a physicalist, and his article, as you see, it's just called Physicalism. So the things that we talked about him, I took you this far. I told you that, first of all, he defines physicalism as the simple idea that everything is physical. Every single thing is made out of matter. And even though there might be other fields of study, like, I don't know, history, literature, philosophy or mathematics, I don't know, I should say math. But at the end of the day, all these topics are really essentially just based around physics, because human beings doing their thing on this planet are just physical objects according to physicalism. So everything having to do with humanity, the universe, or anything else is just an indirect branch of physics. And he says to understand physicalism in the best detail, you'd want to try and grapple with these two major questions. So one he called the interpretation question, which is the question asking, what does it mean to say that everything is physical? And then the other question he calls the truth question, which is the question, is it true that everything is physical? So he's trying now, first of all, to tackle that interpretation question. And he says the best way to try and think of the answer for it, again, what does it mean to say that everything is physical? The best way to answer that is to utilize the notion of supervenience. Okay, so we were now talking about supervenience. The idea of supervenience is best expressed through the analogy or example of a dot matrix picture. Okay, so what's a dot matrix picture? It's a big picture that's made out of tons of little individual dots of ink put in a certain pattern on a grid. So this is one way to generate reproduced copies of the same image, to have the same coordinate set of dots stamped onto an equivalent size grid over and over again. And this is exactly the way that like a printing press generates those printed images in printed materials that we read. Now, on the other hand, you can think about a dot matrix through the example of a computer monitor or telephone or television screen, which is a grid of pixels, and that's what forms the resolution of the device. So the array of pixels ordered along your screen, illuminated in a certain order and pattern, generates the image that you see. So it's really one big picture, but it's based out of a bunch of tiny little individual elements. So whether you're thinking about the elements that build the big picture as ink dots or tiles or pixels, that is the basic concept to have in mind. So I did try to draw you guys like a crude illustration of such an image, just so that we had something to look at and think about in our notes. In my attempt, it was something like this. Not perfect, especially this one. What is that? A pterodactyl? Okay, let me try and make it a little better. Maybe a little better, but it's, it's like a beach, nice day at the beach with the sun and the seagulls or whatever up there in the air. So if this was a dot matrix picture, you have the big picture aspects of it, which are formed out of myriad little dots. And there was terminology that was used. The one word we talked about was global feature. What's a global feature of a dot matrix or some composite image like that? It's just a large scale aspect of it, something that's formed out of the dots combined together. But it's not an individual dot or even just a couple. It's a thing that's made out of them in combination. So for example, in this picture here, one of the global features could be the sun, or one of the birds, or the waves. So notice this about a structural fact concerning these so-called dot matrices or composite images, that if you had two identically arranged grids with the same exact pattern of dots, then they would have to have exactly the same global features. That should be, I hope, clear to everybody, right? Because if there is, like, to the right of this, another image, which is dot for dot a duplicate, then, I mean, by definition, it could not possibly have different global features. So one thing that we can say safely for sure is that if two dot matrices have the same pattern of dots, dot for dot, down to the last detail, then they would have to have all the same global features. And likewise, if two dot matrix pictures had different global features, then they must also differ in the underlying pattern and arrangement of the dots. So if they're the same at the atomic level, basically, they're going to be the same at all higher levels of description. But if they're different at the global level, then they also have to differ at the level of individual dots. Now, this then serves as a kind of analogy to the physical universe, okay? So the claim of supervenience physicalism, which is what we're kind of talking about now. I can erase the title and author information so that we can clearly see that the current concept being presented is the concept of supervenience. The word in the sentence would be used like this: the global features of the image supervene on the pattern of the dots. So the big picture aspects are nothing other than, or nothing more than, the established pattern that exists in that array of atomic elements, in this case dots. Now, if it's the physical universe that we are now going to extend this metaphor to, what do you think would be the equivalent of the individual dots or of whatever when we're talking about physical objects in actual space and time? What do you guys think? Maybe we've discussed this. If so, it'll probably roll right off your tongue. If not, think about it for a second, but I'm sure you'll get to it pretty fast. What do you think would be the stand-in for the so-called dots in actual reality when things are composed out of these in physics and in space? So what do you consider those to be? The little bits, that's right, atoms. So in physical space, the supervenience concept would be substituted by saying that global features, okay, of reality, large-scale objects, things that are formed out of these little individual elements, those are the global features. So the global features of reality are basically nothing other than a combination of the parts that make them up. So any large-scale element or aspect of reality is nothing other than a bunch of these atoms arranged in a particular way. Can you give me an example of a global feature of reality? Now, in this picture, for example, you were able, I think, to say last time that a global feature of it is, for example, the sun or one of the birds. So what could be a global feature of actual reality? Just, there's infinitely many options, but let's see if you could just point one thing out so that we have some common understanding here. What could be one global feature, for example, of the actual world that we're in? What do you think? Let's see what you say. Don't wait for someone else, just you. Go ahead and tell me. What could be a global feature of actual reality? Okay, Marissa, you're saying computer, like maybe your computer or my computer or just any given computer, right? Yeah, that's a fair example, because that's something, of course, it's an object that's made out of a bunch of little atoms, basically. What about something else? How about a public object instead of a category of object, like a computer? How about a specific object that's well known to all of us? That'd be another good example. Computer's fine, but I just want to give one more so that we're all kind of on the same page. What could be another one? Something particular. rather than a category name. Wilson Field? Okay, you mean over there at Chapman University, the field itself. Yes, the field and the entire structure of it is composed out of physical elements, otherwise known as atoms. Would you call, let's see, are you the human being, that you are a global feature according to this taxonomy? Would you say that a person is a global feature of reality? At least according to physicalism and the terminology being used here. Is that a correct statement? That a human being, for example, you yourself, are a global feature of the universe? Just asking, is it true? What do you think? Did you get the question? Oh yeah, okay, good, Marissa. So thanks for helping me out. Everybody though, don't make one person do all the heavy lifting. So yeah, it's true, a human being is a global feature of reality, but it's pretty much, I hope, coming into clear focus. Any object of any size, of any description, is a global feature. Any event or thing that takes place in this universe is a global feature of the universe. The only things that are not global features are what? The atoms themselves, individual atoms. Okay, so now, what we said about the dot matrix picture here is that if you had side by side with it another one that was dot for dot identical, a dot for dot duplicate, then it would have to have all the same global features. And we also said that if a second image had different global features, like a missing bird or something compared to the first image, they differed in some large structural way, then they would also have to be different in the underlying composition and array of the dots. So now this gives us a way to express the concept of physicalism when we compare these pictures to real universe. The concept of supervenience physicalism is as follows. Suppose that there were a second universe, okay, which was the exact same as ours in every atomic fact. So I'm saying, imagine that there is a second universe, which was atomically a duplicate of ours. So the arrangement and order of each atom in that universe is exactly equivalent to the arrangement and order of atoms in this first universe. If the atomic facts were held fixed, then what would this other universe be like? It would have to be exactly identical to ours in every last detail. So if two worlds were physical duplicates at the atomic level, then they would also have to contain all the same events and objects and even psychological phenomena. So if there were another physical universe, according to physicalism, which was atomically identical to ours, then there would be a copy of you even in that universe having the same exact thoughts, experiences, mental life, sensations, and so forth. So the idea here is that consciousness itself is nothing other than the outcome of all the physical atoms being arranged just so. And it would not be possible, for example, for there to be another physical universe which was identical to ours physically, but different in some psychological respect. That would indicate then that everything is made out of atoms, everything is physical, even consciousness, because, for example, if there were another closed physical system with the same atomic facts, then there would have to be the same minds with the same conscious experiences. So this gives us a formal definition of physicalism that I can now state based on the concept of supervenience. And this is what he writes in the book. So physicalism is true at a possible world W. Just in case any world which is an atomic duplicate of W is a duplicate of W in all respects. So this is the clear statement of the concept of supervenience physicalism that the author provides. What does it mean then for physicalism to be true? What does it mean to say that everything is physical? It means that everything supervenes on atoms, including consciousness. When we explain the concept of supervenience, we utilize the example of images or structures that are built out of individual atomic elements. In the case of a dot matrix picture, the atomic elements are ink dots, or in the case of a digital screen that you're viewing like now, the individual elements are pixels. When we carry that example over to physical universe, the structural similarity is that when you have big objects made in this universe, they're ultimately formed of individual atoms, a bunch of them grouped together in a certain way. So just as with the dot matrix pictures, which we can say if there are two of them that have the same dot pattern, they would have to have the same global features. Likewise, it's true of the physical universe. So if there were two physical universes which were atomically identical in their ordering, then they would have to have the same global features as well, including the same aspects of consciousness. So that answers, he thinks, the interpretation question. That is just what it means for everything to be physical, for everything to be built out of atoms such that a duplicate universe, atomically the same, couldn't differ in any possible way. So if we had an atomic duplicate of this universe, it wouldn't just be physically the same, it would be the same historically, psychologically, and everything else. So there would be like copies of all events here, another World War II, another coronavirus outbreak. All those same things would happen if a physical universe had the exact same positioning and ordering of atoms as seen here. So now this is the basic expression of supervenience physicalism. The author Stoljar says it's crucial to understand the idea of supervenience in order to understand what physicalism is all about. And you know, he says the really only place where physicalism receives challenges intellectually is in the whole realm of consciousness and thought. You know, dualism puts pressure on physicalism, and just the idea that consciousness is too rich and subjective and unique to be grounded on just the distribution and ordering of atoms, that's where it seems to receive its greatest challenge. Because nobody really thinks that anything else in the universe is anything other than a physical object. You know, look at just the objects in my immediate surroundings. This board, glass of coffee and some iced tea over there, this table. Nobody looks at those things and says, there's got to be something more than the physical. You know, that's clearly just made out of atoms, and that's uncontroversial, I think. But when you look inside of your own experience as a human being with perception, with thought, with hope, fear, dreams, you know, emotions, psychological states, that's where some people might sort of resist the assumption that physicalism is true. So that's the next point he wants to now get into. Remember, I told you that for Stoljar, there were two questions that he wanted to tackle. One was the interpretation question. What does it mean to say that everything is physical? Supervenience, he thinks, gives us the answer to that. The other question he had, though, is the truth question, which asks, is it true that everything is physical? And now he wants to try and launch into that. So there's a couple of arguments that he gives to pose a positive answer to that question, that yes, it is true. Physicalism is true, but he wants to give arguments to try and convince. Okay, so I'm going to try and help you guys now understand two arguments that he gives towards the conclusion that physicalism is true. So we're still with Daniel Stoljar. Now we're tackling the truth question, and we're going to examine two arguments that he gives to help convince the reader that it is true. Okay. So the first argument, which he discusses here, is called the argument from causal closure. Okay, make sure we understand this word is the word causal. It does not say casual, which is a common misspelling that I see students write in their notes sometimes. But it's the word causal. It's spelled differently. Causal is C-A-U-S-A-L, and it's all about cause and effect. Casual is like, I mean, people wearing like a t-shirt to their office on casual day, but it has nothing to do with being casual. The word is causal. Okay, so argument from causal closure. This is an argument which has three premises, which ultimately lead to the conclusion that mental events are the same thing as physical events, that they are physical events. So let's go with each premise and we'll discuss them one by one. So the first premise says, every event which has a cause has a physical cause. Okay, so the first premise, you see it there, it states that every event that does have a cause has a physical cause. Because we live in a physical universe, so if something happens, some event happens, it has to have a cause, but the cause of the event has to be something physical, otherwise it would not have happened. I mean, if like, for example, a tree branch fell on the hood of somebody's car where it was parked and caused a dent, you could say that's an event, but what's the cause of that event? Well, the weakening of the branch, let's say by passing winds or maybe birds perching there over a certain amount of time causes the bough to gradually become brittle enough to snap off. After it snaps off, the wind currents, its weight, ultimately determine a trajectory downward, and the force that it strikes the hood with causes the dent. And that's a series of physical events that leads to that outcome. So it's not limited to that one example. Any event happening in this physical universe would have to be preceded by some type of physical cause. So at least that's what the first premise is claiming, that if something happens, an event, in other words, of whatever description, it had to have some type of physical basis that caused it. Okay, now the second premise of the argument says that, and this is kind of an interesting premise, it says mental events can cause physical events. Mental events can cause physical events. Okay, so let's try and trace the backstory of a specific historical event. Like, for example, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. So what's the cause of his death? Well, the cause of his death was from a gunshot. And so you can say the physical cause of the death was, the bullet wound and whatever, and the damage that it caused to him. But then you could ask the question, well, why did this bullet strike him? And then I guess you'd have to go back to the firing mechanism of the firearm. And you could say, well, because the trigger was depressed, causing the ejection of the bullet from the chamber at a high velocity, which then, created the injury that killed him. But if you ask yourself, why did the trigger get depressed? Then I guess you would have to say, well, because muscles contracted in the hand of John Wilkes Booth, causing depression of the trigger and thus causing the firing mechanism to proceed. But if you ask, why did the hand depress the trigger? Then I guess, one way of answering that question is to say, well, because signals were sent from the brain causing the muscles to contract. But now we get to the final link in this story. Why did the signal get sent from the brain to the contraction of the hand muscle? Ultimately, that just is caused by what? What would be the ultimate initiating cause of this chain of events that led to the death of Lincoln? What do you think? I've tried to explain it in purely physical terms all the way down. But once we get to the initiation of the causal sequence, the pulling of the trigger, as it were, why did that happen? What would be the first step in the process that led to the ultimate result? The tragic result, of course, but it's far enough back in time that hopefully no one's too hurt by the memory. Yeah, his wanting to do so, right? It was his intention in the mind, right? So it started from a thought process. It started from the person saying, here's something that I want to do. And then they, commanded their body to take the actions that led to that horrible result. But you see, thought led to a physical outcome in this case. Now, we can get into less, of course, morbid and more everyday examples. So, I don't know. Right now, I'm teaching you a philosophy lecture, and I'm about to show you something. What I want to show you is that if a person thinks of doing something, then they can make their body do it. So I'm going to snap my fingers. Not the best snap. Maybe 2 at a time would sound better. Okay, there you go. So my hands just snapped. My fingers snapped. Why did that happen? It's, again, a clear example of me just wanting to show you that thought can proceed to bodily action. And so think of premise 2 along those lines. Basically, that through your thought, through your mind, you can cause events to occur. If you were in the classroom with me and I was teaching this subject, which I've done many times, obviously, I'll sometimes ask a student, what do you think? And the student that will raise their hand, I call on them, and I'll say, okay, so you just raised your hand. Why did your hand go up? That was a physical object, the arm going up into the air. And then the student's only possible answer is because I wanted to ask a question, right? So why did the arm move? Because the mind thought, let me request some information from my professor. Even me just talking to you right now, I mean, my mouth's moving, sounds coming out of my lungs and throat and everything else. Why is that happening? Because I'm thinking it's time to deliver this morning lecture, and let's get it done. So thought basically can lead to action, and that's just what it is to be a living thing like you and me. Taking a walk, writing an essay, logging on to the internet, watching videos of any kind, or doing anything whatsoever. It's all a process that begins with thought and results in some behavioral, observable event. So that just means mental events can cause physical events, which they can. Okay, now third premise. Third premise is, of all these premises in this argument, perhaps the one that's the trickiest, most complex looking. But once I explain it to you, I think that you'll be able to see that the concept itself is not so hard. But first, let's put it up there. So the third premise says this. If an event A causes an event B, so let me put that clause first. If an event A causes an event B, then in that case, there is no other event C which is different from A and which also causes B. I'll write this also in the chat because I can see it's a little compressed, but you'll see it clearly. If an event A causes an event B, then there's no other event C which is different from A and which also causes B. So if A causes B, then there's no other event C which is different from A, which also causes B. And make sure I type it in, and then I'll go over that with you guys really fast. So I'm typing this in the chat bar for a second. That's why I'm kind of closer to the screen. Event A caused an event B, and there's no other event C which is also. Okay. There you go. So I've also put it in the chat bar for your viewing convenience if that's a little bit difficult to read, which it could be. There's still a conclusion to write, so I'm going to have to put that, I guess, at the top after I clear the board. But those are the three premises of the argument. Now let's really think for a second here about the third one. So at a first glance, it might sound like pretty technical. A, B, C, what is all that? But basically, it's not too strange in the end. It's just saying this. If something causes something else, if you have a cause and effect, right? And so A is the cause, B is the effect. All that is really saying is that that means A is the only cause of B. That there's not something else which is a secondary cause of B also. So essentially, if you can understand me, let's see if you can finish this statement. What number 3 premise is saying is that whenever there's some effect, it has to have exactly how many causes? Can you tell me? For each effect, there is how many causes maximum, according to premise 3? Every effect does have a cause, but how many? According to premise 3, yes, exactly, Eric. Just one. One and never more than one. Exactly one. Not 0, but also not 2, 3, or 4, or anything else. So that's basically correct, guys. You're all getting it right. Number 3 is just saying that when there's a cause of an effect, it's the only cause of that effect. So, looking at it, if A causes B, that's the only cause of B. It's not possible that there's some other thing different from A, like, for example, C, which also causes B. Premise 3 is called in the book by the author the exclusion principle, because what it's saying in a way is that if there's one cause of an effect, that excludes all other things from being the cause. So there's only one cause for each outcome, not 2. So then, what these 3 premises imply. Okay, now this is not at all the way an argument should look on the page visually in your notes. The conclusion should be written below. A horizontal line should be here and the conclusion below. So you should just pretend in your mind that this arrow pointing up here is actually below the argument, but I'm just doing this for the sake of, having it all on the same board at once. So the conclusion in the end is that, therefore, mental events are physical events. I'll even write the word therefore so it's clearer to you that that's the conclusion. Therefore, mental events are physical events. Okay, so let's see how this conclusion results from those 3 premises. From premise 1, everything has a physical cause. From premise 2, your mind can cause your physical body to act. Okay? So those physical actions issued from your mind can be thought of as effects that come from a cause. But number 1 and 2 together imply that when your mind causes your body to do something, that is a physical event, namely the brain. The brain activity causes the behavior that everyone can observe and which you then display. Premise 3 then is all important because what premise 3 says is that the brain acting as the physical cause of your behavior is the only cause of your behavior. So basically what 3 is saying is that it's not possible that your behavior is both caused by your physical brain, but also by something else aside from it, like a ghost or a soul or a spirit. So it basically is saying that the brain is already a sufficient explanation of the behavior that you exhibit, and therefore there's no possibility for there to be something over and above the brain which causes your behavior. The brain is a physical cause of your behavior, and since every event only has one cause, that's the only cause of your behavior. So it's not both the mind and the brain, it's just the brain. It's not both the brain and the soul or something, or the spirit, because that would basically be to say that there's 2 causes of your behavior. Your brain, which we know is involved, and then second, separate from that, this non-physical immaterial mind. That, I guess, according to the argument anyway, would be to multiply causes beyond necessity, whereas we already have the physical explanation secured by the existence of the brain and its physical behavior. There would therefore be no point or logical basis to assume that there's a second cause active or operating as well. Okay, guys, so I'm hopefully making this something that you can understand, because in an initial glance, it could be a bit confusing, but let's just kind of run through it one last time. Every event that has a cause has a physical cause. Okay, so a plant grows because, you know, sunlight hits it physically, water goes in there physically, etc., or anything else that you want to talk about. A car turns on because, you know, the ignition is set, and then the transmission starts, whatever, and that's physical all the way down. So every event, not just those two, but just giving you two examples, every event in this universe has a physical cause. Now, your mind, just as we know, can cause your behavior. Like I'm speaking to you right now, or anything else under the sun. If I was playing the guitar or an instrument, you know, that's a physical act, but it's being done by my mind, which leads to the behavior of the body. From number 3, though, that physical event that's produced by your mind, which has a physical cause, like every event does, it's only that physical cause, not both the physical and also a second non-physical cause of the same thing. So therefore, the conclusion is that your mind causing events to occur with your body and behavior, that's just physical. And if mental events are physical events, then everything's physical, because that's the only thing that's even a candidate to be something non-physical. If the mental life and behavior of the mind is just brain activity, then there's no real room, I guess, in the description of the universe for non-physical causes to enter the picture, because the brain is enough to explain it all. So adding something second to it would be, I guess, unnecessary and superfluous, at least according to the argument. Okay, so that's one argument for that physicalism is true. The argument from causal closure. But there's one more, okay? So we'll finish with Daniel Stoljar today by just going over this last argument of his towards the truth of physicalism. So the other one, now I'm going to erase this. The second one is, like, I think, considerably more straightforward and simple. So, you know, the first one we just talked about there is more interesting also, but it's a little more complicated. This second one is just called the argument from methodological naturalism, and it's pretty basic. Argument from methodological naturalism. Okay, so this argument just says, first of all, first premise, that it's reasonable to believe what is believed by the methods of natural science. So it's reasonable or rational, whatever word you want to use, they're basically synonyms. It's reasonable to believe what is believed by the methods of natural science. Okay, so that's one premise. It is reasonable to believe what is believed by science, pretty much. So basically that premise just says that whatever the consensus or approach that science has to things is a reasonable thing for you to believe too. So if you go with what science says, nobody can say you're just being irrational. I mean, at a minimum, even if you don't always agree with science in some cases, it's hard to dispute that this is at least reasonable, because the whole practice of science is to try and give testable explanations for observed phenomena. So you can't just be a scientist who shrugs and be like, I don't know, I just feel like that's the way it goes. You have to be able to give a thorough explanation of your hypothesis, which could be tested for its accuracy. So therefore, it's all about giving reasons in a community of like-minded inquirers who can reproduce the results. So that's the first premise. It's just reasonable to believe what is believed by science. The second premise says that physicalism is believed by the methods of natural science. Okay, now I know my cat's kind of blocking the screen there, but let me just type that so that you can all, make sure it's in our notes clearly. Okay, so right there in the chat bar, you can see the second premise. And what it says is that physicalism is believed by the methods of natural science. So this argument, I think, should be easy enough for you to deduce the conclusion. Put those two premises together and tell me if you can judge what the conclusion should be here. Premise 1 says, it's reasonable to believe what is believed by the methods of natural science. Premise 2 says that physicalism is believed by the methods of natural science. So therefore, what do you think could be the conclusion of that argument? It's reasonable to believe what science does. Science believes physicalism. Therefore, hit me with the conclusion. Go ahead. What is it? Not too bad, this one, I think. Reasonable to believe physicalism. Sorry, well, oops, but never mind that. Just you can tell me the conclusion. It's reasonable to believe what's believed by the methods of natural science. Physicalism is believed or assumed to be true by the methods of natural science. Therefore, what? Marissa, therefore it is reasonable to believe physicalism. Yes, correct. Tell me, why again, Marissa, is it reasonable to believe? That's the conclusion. What's the reason that's reasonable? You're correct. Yes, that's right. That's the right conclusion. But just fill me in on the reason, the reason that led you to the conclusion. Why does the argument say it's reasonable to believe physicalism? Because. So anyway, yes, conclusion. So therefore, it is reasonable to believe physicalism. And I was trying to get you to say this, but the reason that's reasonable, according to the argument anyway, is because it's reasonable to believe whatever science believes. And science methodologically assumes physicalism. So the argument here is in a way simple-minded. It's basically saying if you believe what scientists believe, then you cannot be considered irrational. And Marissa, you have it here, because if science is reasonable to believe, and physicalism is believed by science, then physicalism is reasonable to believe. That's what I think you should have said at the end, because you repeated yourself, but that's what I know that you intended. So it's reasonable to believe this. Why again? According to the argument, it's reasonable to believe it because whatever science believes is reasonable, and science believes in physicalism. Now, the reason, in my judgment, that this is not as interesting as an argument as the previous one, the argument from causal closure, is because it kind of tells you to outsource the intellectual labor to these presumed smart scientists. And to be honest, we do have to have a division of intellectual labor. Like, we cannot all be theoretical physicists or astronomers or, geneticists who have all the detailed specialized knowledge. So we have, obviously, as an epistemic and a human community, we have to defer to the greater expertise that some people have in areas where we have not built up that same knowledge, right? So surely you should listen when a professional or an expert gives you their professional judgment on something. But at the same time, I would prefer an argument where I myself am treated to the reasons why physicalism is thought to be true. And that's why I think the first one is a little bit more intellectually satisfying, just to me. Because it says, here are some reasons that physicalism is true, because every event just has one cause, and your brain is already a sufficient explanation or cause of your behavior, so why think that there should be anything other than the brain? This argument, though, just says, if you follow the lead of smart scientists, you'll be reasonable too, and for some reason, those scientists assume physicalism, so just kind of copy them and you'll be judged reasonable because you take the same conclusions that scientists do. But that kind of makes their own reasoning patterns and processes like a black box that you can't see into. Like, just go with the scientists because they're presumed to be rational. In a way, it's not necessarily a bad argument, because it's hard to contest either premise. You really can't say that scientists are unreasonable, and it's true that they believe in physicalism. But anyway, in my mind, it's a little bit more robust of an argument to give you yourself the independent reasons as to why physicalism is likely to be true, instead of just saying, go with the scientists, defer to their expertise, outsource the intellectual labor to them, and then follow the conclusions that they've, arrived at. So anyway, that's it for Daniel Stoljar. Now we've seen one physicalist author, and we have now got two different positions to see the kind of disagreement expressed. So first of all, it was Descartes' dualism. Now we hear Daniel Stoljar's case for physicalism. Next class, we're going to go continuing through our notes on physicalism. So we're a little behind, but not in a significant way. So on Wednesday, we're going to look at the article by J.J.C. Smart. And then on Friday, we'll talk about Alan Turing's paper about whether machines could ever have consciousness. So at that point, we might be one lecture behind in the official course schedule, but I believe we'll be able to catch up with the remaining time that we have in the next couple weeks. So anyways, guys, thanks so much again. I really appreciate you guys getting up and attending and participating and everything else. So take care. Hopefully you guys are still healthy and doing really well during the whole lockdown and stuff. And if you ever need anything, let me know. I'm always checking my emails, but have a great one, and have a good Monday, and I'll see you guys back on Wednesday. Okay, thanks again, and bye-bye.